Go ahead. Okay, go ahead, you can talk. Say, okay, you're ready.
Okay.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our Iyun. We're really excited to see everyone here. And in just a minute, Yosefa is going to begin. Yosefa, are you there?
Okay, just say, you'd like to say something.
I would like to say something when we start about the dedication.
Oh, okay. Yes, please. Go ahead.
My sister Donna and I are very happy to sponsor these shiurim in memory of our uncle and aunt, Romie and Blanche Shapiro. Through a marriage of 78 years, they were a true partnership that gave generously of themselves to many, many causes and were an inspiration to all of us. May their memory be a blessing.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yosefa.
Yeah, I'm here. I'll begin. Okay, 1 second. Hold on 1 second. I was gonna share my screen. Okay, everyone can see? Maybe Elle, you just give me a nod to let me know.
We only see part of it. It's half off the screen, actually. A little bit better. You might have to make it a little smaller. But it's basically on.
That doesn't make any sense. Hold on.
Yosefa, I see it fine.
You see it fine. Okay, I'll go back to what it was before. Okay, you see it fine, Donna?
Yes, you can go.
Okay, great. Okay, so good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this evening that has been dedicated to the memory of two seemingly very special people. I haven't taken part in the Iyun for Pesach in many, many years, so it's good to be back. And the topic for the, I think, relatively short shir this evening is really Shemot, the second chapter of Shemot. It's one of my favorite parakim in all of Tanakh. It's to me, it's similar in a way to the book of Breshit, which I feel like sort of puts the whole Torah in there in bite-sized pieces. I really believe that the second chapter of Shemot kind of has the essence of both the experience of Yetziat Mitzrayim and also some of the experiences in the wilderness sort of tucked in to this parak. So we're going to be looking at this parak, really not the point, we're not going to be looking at the women per se, which is the first half of the parak, but we're going to be focusing really on the second half of the parak where Moshe comes of age. It's sort of his coming of age story, and to see how these events both shed light on the liberation that is to come in Eretz Mitzrayim, and also how it sheds light on Moshe's leadership that will be taking form as the parshiot develop. So that's sort of the way we're going to look at it. But again, because it's a chapter that has so many, I think, has so many levels to it that really can be looked at from so many different angles. So those are the two chosen angles for tonight: how it reflects the coming exodus from Egypt, and also how it reflects the leadership that will be Moshe's leadership as he continues on through time. So we'll start with the beginning, but then we'll skip past all the wonderful women in the story. The first few psukim, right? Vayelech ish mibet Levi, vayikach et bat Levi. That we have here are anonymous characters. Famously, everybody's anonymous until we meet Moshe. It's kind of like that there's like this spotlight that we want to make sure that we keep our eye on the ball. So all these people who do wonderful things, the daughter of Paro and his sister and his mother, but none of them get names. And of course, that's true about the two people who begin this entire chapter, and those are the mother and the woman and man from the tribe of Levi. So we have here what seems to be not a big deal, right? You have many times a union that takes place, a woman becomes pregnant, sort of the ways of the world. Of course, this event is really cataclysmic because in the parak that came before Shemot Bet, you had the prohibition to have any more children. And so this isn't just any birth, but it's going to be the birth of a baby boy when we know that his fate is going to have to be a tragic one. But I actually wanted to point our attention to something else, which is the identity of Moshe's parents, that, of course, we don't know yet who they are, but we have here their lineage from the tribe of Levi that's particularly highlighted. And while we usually jump ahead and we think about these very unique women in the story, we often overlook this factor, which is that the parak opens in an utterly surprising way, because the last time we left the tribe of Levi, they seem to be doomed to a very negative fate. We have here from Breshit, this is from Breshit Memchet from chapter 48, the curse, or sort of the negative prediction that Yaakov gives to his sons, Levi and Shimon together. Shimon veLevi achim klei Hamas mecherotehem. You basically are joined by your weapons of violence. And then Yaakov expresses this idea that he wouldn't even want to be part of their brethren, right? Besodam al tavo nafshi, bekahalam al techad kvodi, ki be'apam hargu ish uvirtzonam ikru shor. That he speaks about these violent acts. Of course, many of us might be familiar with the connection, perhaps it's suggested by most, to the events in Shechem, but I think that it's also very compelling that they probably were violent in more than one scenario. And the Shechem episode is the one that we're familiar with. But either way, they're cursed by Yaakov. Ahurapam ki az, the most classic curse language you can have, to be the Aleph Resh Resh. Achalkem b'Yaakov afitzem b'Yisrael. Okay, you're going to be scattered all over. Now, ultimately, the fate of Shimon is to be scattered all over in the negative sense, and the fate of Levi will be to be scattered all over, but because they'll be in Levitic cities and they'll be teaching Am Yisrael. But when the point that I really want to bring for right now is simply that when we read these psukim, we should be very surprised, because we would last expect that our greatest leader would emerge from the tribe of Levi. And I think that among many things that this idea perhaps comes to tell us is the ability for people to mold their own destiny and to make decisions that ultimately can change the course of things, even if their DNA or their tribal lineage, or however we want to call it, is one that is particularly negative. Opening up this chapter, and we're sort of surprised, Ramon, and then we say, okay, well, here are two people making a choice to do things differently. I would even say, not in the tribal sense, but it kind of reminds us a little bit even of the book of Ruth against the backdrop of the period of the Shoftim, that it's a rough time period of tremendous chaos and people doing whatever they want, but all it takes is one woman and one man to make a choice to behave differently. And they can ultimately, says the Navi, can ultimately really change also the course of history, in that case establishing the Davidic dynasty, and here it's establishing Moshe's leadership. So the first moment of this parak in and of itself is kind of revolutionary, because it flips this sort of prediction that we had about Levi and really sends us in a different direction. So that's the first piece. And we have, of course, the story of Moshe physically being saved by his sister, and then by his mother, by his sister, and then by Bat Paro. We're going to skip along for now. I do just want to say that what I think, because I really want to draw upon these sort of small internal narratives for what they reflect about Moshe's leadership in the future. And we have here of unusual, it's a one-time event of tremendous influence of women on the lives of a young boy. That's not something that we will ever see again in the same volume in any other story. And we have different elements of heroism, right? Whether it's a mother who is doing what she has to do, keeping him as long as she can, and then moving forward, and putting him in a spot by the Nile where she assumed that he will be seen quicker than somewhere else. And the sister going out to watch, and Bat Paro, who of course goes against her father's decree, right? That's the most surprising element here. It's not any woman who finds him, it's the daughter of he who decreed that all these boys should die. And what's so fascinating about this is that in one of the more jarring, I would say, outbursts that Moshe has later in his career is this pasuk from Bamidbar in the 11th chapter. Ha'anochi hariti et kol ha'am hazeh, Moshe being utterly exasperated by the people's complaints, and he says to God, have I carried, right? Have I been pregnant with, possibly conceived, possibly be pregnant with this entire nation? Imanochi Yilidatihu, did I give birth to them? Ki tomar elai se'ehu bechikecha kasher yisa ha'omen et hayonek al ha'adama asher nishbata la'avotav. And the image he uses of being exasperated is he's saying, these are my children. These are your children. And he uses this image, and there's so much discussion about what does it mean, because he speaks about imagery that's really feminine, but he puts it in the masculine form. Ha'omen et hayonek, we have here sort of here it says, the translation is nursing father, but it perhaps means some sort of adoptive parent, but somebody who takes in this child who is still nursing. And the imagery is very, very surprising, but because Moshe sees himself, he doesn't agree with this. He says, God, they're your people. I didn't give birth to them. But what we see through this rejection is that Moshe feels that his job as a leader has become to essentially mother them and to nurse them through the process in the desert. And this is my idea. I wrote on the side on the PowerPoint here where I first saw this, but this is one place, certainly in the most obvious way, where we see perhaps the initial female influence on Moshe's life and how much it shaped what he views as being possibly the job of a leader. He doesn't feel up for the task. He also wants to be clear about what his responsibilities are supposed to be. But it's very possible that what we see here is sort of this influence on his life from his early years that sort of resurfaces later on when he's most exasperated. And I'll also say that, when we are most uncontrolled, when we have lost our greatest grasp on reality, or on our, just when we're no longer in control, that is when those really deep sort of unbridled parts of us emerge. And so the fact that this is what comes out of his mouth, it's the image that he speaks when he is most undone, really bespeaks a very, very primal part of who he is. And we'll find ourselves yelling at our child, and all of a sudden we hear our parent in that moment. That's part of it, meaning that sort of primal wiring comes out. So I think the fact that this comes out here really attests to how much the influence of these women had an impact on Moshe. So that's a first piece of where we see the women themselves, where they may emerge in Moshe's consciousness later on as a leader, and he doesn't feel that he is there to live up to that task. Now, the second part of the parak, which starts in Pasuk Yud Aleph, is Moshe really coming into the world. And he also comes into a world where he meets men, meaning there's a very separate, something I only recently was thinking about. There's something very different about his interactions with the world in the first 10 psukim versus the next 10 psukim. In the first 10, it's a predominantly female world. It's a world of a young boy. And so those are the people that dominate his life. And then now he meets a world of men, and it's a very different place than the compassion and the going above and beyond that we see in the first 10 psukim. And so we have three vignettes. We have three vignettes that describe Moshe's sort of coming of age. And what I would claim is that these three vignettes are there to explain, probably justify God's choice of Moshe immediately in the coming chapter. Meaning in chapter 3, in Perek Gimel, God approaches Moshe in the famous burning bush episode. And the backgrounds to that happening are these three stories. Now, it's so unusual because as we know, we usually know very little about our greatest biblical figures before they're chosen, right? Famously, Abraham, we know barely anything more about him other than the fact that he had gone on a journey with his father, and that likely, if you do the math, preceded the commandment of Lech Lecha. But we don't know why God chooses Abraham, which is why the Midrashim have to fill in so much of that information for us, because the Torah doesn't fill it in. And that's the case with really the vast majority of our greatest biblical figures. And that's what makes these three vignettes so precious and so unique, because they do give us a window into who Moshe was. Now, there are opinions out there that look at these events as negative reflections of Moshe, and they show you the journey he had to go on to become the great person that he was. I don't really share that opinion. I think that the vast majority of these elements are meant to be highly positive. And like all of us, as we grow older, we have to sort of hone in on our positive traits and make sure that we navigate them and utilize them in the world in the best way possible. So again, these are familiar episodes, but I want to look at them for how they surface again, both in the story of Mitzrayim and also in Moshe's life. ויהי בימים ההם ויגדל משה ויצא אל אחיו וירא בסבלותם וירא איש מצרי מכה איש עברי מאחיו ויפן כה וכה וירא כי אין איש ויך את המצרי ויטמנהו בחול. And so we have our first episode here where certainly one thing that categorizes how he behaves is that Moshe is unable to sit on the side as he sees a clear moral atrocity in his eyes. Of course, it's always an interesting topic that he goes out to his brethren. How did he know that they were his brethren? Had he been told that? Did he grow up always with some sort of knowledge of his Israelite identity? But what we see here is that he sees an Egyptian man who's hitting an Israelite man, and he takes action. Now, one piece I want to share about how this relates to the coming story is the verb vayach, okay, which if you transfer it to another word and it becomes makah, okay? So this is sort of the first hitting of the Egyptian, which will develop into many makot in the coming prakim, and also I would say the vanquishing of the Mitzrim. So this is what I would even say is sort of a foreshadowing of what will come in the future, and how Moshe, led by Moshe's efforts, obviously through God, he will vanquish the Egyptians themselves. So that's one piece here that really, again, to sort of pluck it out of its place of the Moshe story, it really relates to the broader story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And also, he identifies here with the underdog, meaning it may be that he's identifying because he feels connected and related to them, and he also may be somebody who, because he has such a strong feeling of need for justice, which we'll see develop in the coming stories, that he also maybe by nature identifies with he who was being hit. And so we also see here that Moshe uses his strength and not, he uses his hands, and that is what becomes his effective tool. We'll look at the second episode, and then we'll again zoom out for a moment. ויצא ביום השני, והנה שני אנשים עברים ניצים, ויאמר לרשע, למה תכה רעך? Okay, so he sees now two Israelites fighting, and he immediately identifies, in his mind at least, who is the guilty party and who is not, and he says to him, why are you hitting him? ויאמר מי שמך לאיש שר ושופט עלינו, הלהרגני אתה אומר כאשר הרגת את המצרי, וירא משה ויאמר אכן נודע הדבר. וישמע פרעה את הדבר הזה, ויבקש להרוג את משה, ויברח משה מפני פרעה, וישב ארץ מדיין, וישב על הבאר. In our second episode, we have here a very different story. We have here Moshe approaching two Israelites with his words, although one is hitting the other, one is physically, it seems, abusing the other. And they talk back to Moshe. And they are, well, I would say, chutzpahdik, right? Why are you getting involved? What is your place in this argument? Now, this is a very significant piece, and of course, they reflect the fact that they know what he did to the Egyptian, but this is a significant piece because it comes up later on in Shemot Perek Yudchet, where we see how this episode sort of surfaces again in Moshe's life. When he has a meeting with his father-in-law, Yitro, this is right before Matan Torah, and in the beginning, the meeting is really just very lovely. Moshe updates Yitro about all that's happened, catches them up on all of the events of Yetziat Mitzrayim. They're reminiscing. And in the second part, we have that famous sort of conversation where Yitro observes Moshe's behavior when it comes to the adjudication of all the cases of the nation and lets him know that he thinks that he's not doing this in the wisest way. And he says, what are you doing? Lo tov hadavar asher ata oseh. This isn't a good idea. Navol tibol gam ata gam ha'am hazeh asher imach ki chaved mimcha hadavar lo tuchal asohu levadecha. He says, you're going to fall apart. You're going to totally wither away. You can't do this alone. The people will also wither because they won't have a proper justice system that can service all of their needs. And this won't work. And he gives him advice. Okay, and what does he say to him? You have to sort of delegate the power, and then only the biggest, most difficult cases will get to you. You'll be the Supreme Court. I was going to say the Bagatz, but that's not a good parallel in Israel's system, and certainly don't want to open up that can of worms right now. And so in Pasuk of Aleph, he says, "Ve'ata techazeh mikol ha'am anshei chayil, yir'ei Elohim anshei emet, son'ei vatza," right? To find these people who are going to be courageous, honest judges. V'samta aleihem sarei alafim, sarei me'ot, sarei chamishim, v'sarei asarot. That you are going to make these systems of those who are going to be in charge of X number of people. And again, it's a tiered system, and you bring the most difficult cases to the higher courts. ושפטו את העם בכל עת, והיה כל הדבר הגדול יביאו אליך, וכל הדבר הקטון ישפטו הם, והקל מעליך ונשאו איתך. Right? This is how it'll work. The difficult cases will come to you. The easier cases will be adjudicated by the lower courts. And this will make life easier, right? It'll be lighter for you. Now, and he says, "Ve'im et hadavar hazeh ta'aseh v'tzivcha Elohim v'yachalta amod v'gam kol ha'am hazeh al mekomo yavo b'shalom." Right? He says everything will function better. Now, if I go back for a second to this earlier story, I've highlighted the phrase because here it says "V'samta lehem sarei alafim," and here the phrase was where he says "Mi samcha leish sar v'shofet alenu." We have the same phrasing that's used in both of those places, and again, if we could draw out from these parallels, which is that Moshe initially in this initial encounter in sort of a more haphazard way gets involved in this fight between these two Israelites in a way that isn't very successful, right? It doesn't end well, and he ends up having to run away because he is sort of he comes out with the underhand in this encounter. And I would say maybe perhaps it's sort of a tikkun, or later on when Moshe has this interaction with his father-in-law, who we're going to see in a moment in the coming story, that we see that Moshe really develops this part of his leadership, which here we see it in its mamash early stages, early saplings of his touch with the judiciary, and later on he is going to sort of pile on the responsibilities onto himself, perhaps because like many people in the beginning, it's difficult to delegate. Something is your baby, or it's your responsibility, and it's hard to imagine giving it over to somebody else. But ultimately, Moshe's job is going to be the sar of the sarim, meaning he's going to be the judge's judge. He's going to be in that higher tier. And so I think that also really has a direct correlation to to this episode we see here. Here it's in its rawest form. It isn't particularly successful. And later on, Moshe also struggles, but then comes in the great help of his father-in-law. And of course, the greatest strength that Moshe displays there is his ability to listen to that piece of advice. And that itself is the sign of a tremendous leader. Leaders who are able to delegate and who are able to take advice from others and to decipher what's good advice and what isn't good advice. That is one of the most important, remarkable notes of positive, effective leadership. So that's sort of the second vignette that we have in the story. And Moshe then, of course, has to run away as a result of this interaction. One other piece that I'll point out is the idea of the speaking. Now, Moshe in the first episode kills the Egyptian, and I guess you can call it a success. Unclear exactly how we define that, but he achieves his desired goal. In his second episode, he speaks to the Israelites and is far less successful. And in this vein, we also see two elements that return later on in Moshe's career, which is the speaking versus hitting. And that, of course, is Moshe's his moment of downfall, is when God says to him, and they're thirsting for water, and they're supposed to gather the people. So his job was to speak to the rock. I will say that right now there is an unexplained water, hafsakat mayim. There's no water flowing in my entire neighborhood right now. So I'm feeling very much at one with this story, sending kids to sleep without any showers or brushing their teeth. If only I could talk to my faucet and it would work. So he's supposed to speak, and of course, famously in Pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayarem Moshe et yado vayachat hasela b'mateu pa'amayim v'yitz'u mayim rabim v'tesh ha'ida uve'iram. And he hits it twice. And what's so troubling about this is that it actually works, meaning, unfortunately, it's a method that works, but it wasn't the method that God had wanted him to utilize. And so his punishment in Pasuk Yud Bet, Vayomer Adonai Moshe ve'el Aaron, Yan lo ha'emantem bi la'akdisheni le'inei bnei Yisrael, lechen lo taviu et ha'kahal hazeh el ha'aretz asher natati lahem. Now, of course, it's always a very striking punishment for a crime that seems not really to justify it. But again, of the many ideas offered, is that there seems to be something in Moshe's method of leadership that is incredibly effective and powerful for a certain moment in time for Am Yisrael, and that isn't the method of leadership that God wants to continue on in the future. But I just want to point out here is that we see these elements of speaking in versus hitting in this first chapter where we meet Moshe, and there is where already we see that his hitting was more impactful than the speaking. The speaking got him in trouble, and that again points to this primal place of what's sort of been imbued in Moshe's internal mainframe of the ways of leadership that are effective. I would also say that again, all the system of the makot are a system of physical, right, of creating physical harm. Those are things that create a very, very, very big impression. And I think that they're meant to be there and they're effective for a certain period of time, but then comes a different period of time where God is demanding a different kind of leadership, and that transition becomes apparently too much to bear. Now, the third vignette in our story is of course meeting the daughters of Yitro. Now, who's not called Yitro here? Sorry, it's called Reuel. But I mentioned the story before of Yitro coming to speak to Moshe. Again, whether it's his father-in-law or perhaps the father of his father-in-law, however you figure out the difference of names. But of course, the fact that he comes up here, right, and we said it's connected to the story itself of when he shows up later, I think also was a very important piece. There are other elements that connect those two narratives as well. And so here we have Moshe who comes up, and here's his final act sort of justice seeking. They need to fill up their water troughs to bring back to their father's flock. Vayavo haroim vayigelshum vayako Moshe vayoshi'an vayash et tzonam. Now, he doesn't just, let's say, it doesn't just say he removed the stone from the well, as we see by Yaakov, but we have also here very powerful words. Just to point out one, we have here the verb. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to that after. We have here the garash. One of the main verbs that's used to describe God taking us out of Egypt is the verb garash, that we will be sort of chased out. And so here we have a chasing away, which is the harassing shepherds, and he comes vayoshi'an, and he saves them. Also a very, very key verb when it comes to what Moshe's role will be in the Exodus story. And so we have here also the Moshe, the tremendous coming and saving the day. So that will happen in Egypt itself, and of course that happens here. So it's also really a foreshadowing of the story that comes afterward. And then of course he says, you can't leave this guy there. He's obviously a great catch. And they tell him, Ish Mitzri hatzidanu, pasuk Yutet 19, miyad haroim v'gam dalo dala lanu vayash et hatzon. Right? He's this great person. He also got rid of our harassers, and he also drew water for us. ויאמר לבנותיו ואיוב ולמה זה עזבתן את האיש קראן לו ויאכל לחם. Right? You have to get him back. You have to show gratitude to him, and of course also we'll make a good shidduch out of it. And so this of course ties into another mode of story, which is of course the meeting your wife by the well story, but we'll leave it on the side for now. It's another sort of crossover between this narrative and other narratives in Tanakh. But I just want us to see one idea, which is expressed also by multiple people I have written on the slide, which is the fact that Moshe's justice seeking really broadens as the parak continues. That initially he is helping a Hebrew slave. The next episode are two Hebrews, and the third are Midianite women, meaning his justice seeking knows no bounds, it knows no ties of kinship. It isn't particular to a particular gender, meaning Moshe sees something and can't hold back from trying to fix it. And that, of course, by the way, brings us back to the initial point about the tribe of Levi, meaning this is where we see most strongly Moshe's, I would say, his propensity or his sort of character trait that is like the Levi'im, like Levi that we saw in Breshit, who also, when he saw his sister being wronged, could not hold back. Moshe reflects a very similar tendency, although I believe that in this context, it's meant to be looked at highly positively, whereas our relationship with that act of violence in Shechem is more complex. It's more of a morally complex situation, whereas here it's not. And so, but that also connects Moshe very much to his Levitic legacy of justice seeking, of being unable to sit on the side and watch something that feels utterly inappropriate and wrong. So, okay. The parak ends. I'm going to go here for one moment. The parak ends with a birth. It actually ends the way it begins. It began with the birth of a child, and it ends with the birth of a child. And he marries Tzipora. ותלד בן ויקרא את שמו גרשום, כי אמר גר הייתי בארץ נוכריה. Now, it's a sad ending to the parak, meaning on one hand, he is a child, which is lovely, but the naming of his son, well, on the one hand, as I have here, reflects the verb garash. There's two elements of the name Gershon. He speaks about the idea of being a ger, of being an outsider. We'll get back to that in a moment. But the name itself, like many names, when we have name derivations or miglashe shem, they're often not totally in sync with the verb. This happens all the time in many names, and it's okay. There often are two elements of the name to be discussed. So the name Gershom is garash, right? Is to be forced out. And so we have here in Shemot Yud Aleph, again, where I mentioned it by name before, Vayomer Hashem Moshe od nega echad avi al Paro ועל מצרים, אחרי כן ישלח אתכם מזה, כשלחו כלה, גרש יגרש אתכם מזה. Right? You will be thrust out of Egypt. On the other hand, the name also reflects this idea of being an outsider, and it also recalls the Brit Ben Abtarim, which we have on the left side here. ויאמר לאברהם, ידוע תדע כי גר יהיה זרעך בארץ לא להם, ועבדום ועינו אותם 400 שנה. And so the name Gershom actually brings multiple elements together. It brings both the promise that God made to Abraham that you will be outsiders in the land, i.e. in Egypt, right? And then eventually you will leave and come to Eretz Yisrael. And it also sort of folds within it the idea of being thrust out of Egypt, which points to sort of a more optimistic space. But within the life of Moshe itself, the name reflects something that's very sad and lonely, meaning at this point in time, he's still far away from Egypt, which, by the way, it's a very big question with this name. Which land is he referring to? Is he referring to the land of Midian? Is he referring to the land of Egypt? You know, from what does he feel thrust out of or an outsider in? I think that it's Egypt, and so we see here that Moshe sort of ends this perek feeling that he's alone. And I think that also tends to be the destiny of many great leaders. Again, he doesn't know yet that he's about to be a leader, but the destiny of great people is often to feel slightly isolated from the rest of the population. And like Yosef, who also sort of monumentalizes or sets into place his difficult feelings in the name of his child, so too does Moshe, right? When Yosef does that, he speaks of the fact that his, Nashani, it's Beit David, that he's sort of put behind him everything that happened in his father's household. He sort of remembers the difficulties that he's put behind him. And here we have Moshe really putting at the front the fact that he feels separate, he feels alienated from his home. Now, I think it also speaks to another level, which is that Moshe is alienated from his home on many levels, right? Whether he thinks of his home as the palace of Egypt, or if he knows about his original Israelite family, there's many levels to Moshe's alienation or separation from those places that he could call home. And so it's not surprising, but it's a melancholic ending to this perek, that's what he chooses to memorialize in the name of his son. And a lot of what is going to happen is Moshe is going to have to sort of go on this journey to figure out how to become reconnected to those people. And that is really what brings us right into the 3rd chapter of Shemot, where God comes to him with this mission, and he says, no way, this is not something I'm capable of. Meaning I'm not worthy, but also I'm not going to be convincing. He's going to need God to convince him many times that he is going to be convincing, because he really views himself as an outsider on so many levels. And on one hand, as Ibn Ezra points out, more famously, him being an outsider from among the slave population is incredibly crucial to him being a successful leader, because someone with a slave mentality would never have been able to even envision or have the agency to then lead a people out of it. And, he needed the communication skills of Egyptian, and he needed to be somebody who knew how to get around in the upper echelons of Egypt, and to have, again, that confidence and that agency. But on the other hand, there's something about Moshe that constantly is a little bit on the outside, and he's going to struggle with that as time goes on as well, along as with his leadership, of how to perhaps try and bridge that gap, and then ultimately, I think, not even try to bridge it anymore, and just sort of accept the fact that his space as leader is to really function in a totally different realm, which will be expressed in so many ways in the future. So, I guess. I'm not sure. I think we're going to leave a few minutes for questions at the end. So for those who have raised their hand virtually, I'm happy to answer any questions in a few moments. But I guess I wanted to finish with one idea, which which is from the always unbelievable Leon Kass, who writes the following in his commentary on the book of Shemot. He says, unlike Father Abraham, who was childless at age 75 when God first called him with a promise of becoming a great nation, and for whom the birth of a son by his barren wife Sarah served as the goal for his adventures, founder Moses will have already established his family before he receives in the next chapter his God-given mission. This marked difference signals that we are no longer in the family-preserving phase of God, but are in the more complicated nation-building phase. With Moshe, as with the Israelite people, fertility has been achieved. Ufaru, Rubu, Vishwatsu, right? Those initial opening psukim in the first chapter of Shemot, where we're just, where we're reproducing with no end in a way that recalls the opening of Sefer Breshit, almost as if we're the Shratzim. A populous Israelite nation is enslaved in Egypt. The man who will lead them out is from the start moved by something more than a desire for progeny. Meaning what he says here is that it's significant that the parak ends with Moshe having a child. I sort of highlighted the personal, somewhat sad biographical piece for Moshe. But what Leon Kass is saying here is that he doesn't live in desperation for, will I have a child? Will I continue? Will my legacy exist in the world? That's not what's going to drive Moshe's leadership. And that's a very big break from what we saw in the book of Breshit. And Moshe being our first leader in the book of Shemot, we sort of are taking note of that his goal now is not about creating family. We'll see also he's the most separate from his family of most of the biblical leaders in the Torah itself. But his goal is a national one, is to remove them from there. And I would say also that it's a moral one. And that does put him on a somewhat related playing field with Abraham, who also was trying to create a certain moral base in the world that hadn't been there before. But Moshe needs to lead an entire nation and to imbue an entire nation with a particular Israelite morality that will, of course, be expressed in the laws of the Torah, which is it's a much bigger mission than the one that Abraham and the other avot have within the book of Breshit. Of course, we've expanded this through Midrashim and through their legacies are much greater than just how they influence their own children, although of course that's a tremendous mission in this world as well. But what he says here is that Moshe's mission from the get-go was not about family, and his mission from the get-go was about creating and sort of imbuing this nation with a morality and with a destiny that would serve a much broader population. And so I guess I want to sort of summarize and end here and say that we see here in the first in this first meeting with Moshe, there are really multiple elements that sort of crisscross with many other stories in the book of Shemot and even in the book of Bamidbar. We have these elements just of Moshe's leadership itself, which to him, there's some primal piece of him that sort of compares it with the role of women, who have, of course, had such a important influence on his survival, and probably more than that in his earliest years. And we have other elements of his interactions, which on one hand show his desire to achieve justice, to make sure that the injured party does not lose out, and also how those had echoes that reverberate later on in his career that show up in other books of the Torah. I think that there is always that's something that moves me so much about the fact that the Torah does give us the blessing of providing us with some information about Moshe's early years. And I think that part of that is because he is meant to lead the entire nation, right? I'm not saying, I mean, look, the Torah said itself that Moshe will be the greatest leader we ever had. And so when I think about other prophets who I would also love to know a little bit about their childhood, but the Nevi'im don't tell us about them, that there's something I think that the Torah says, I usually don't go through this kind of detail, but I think you need it in order to understand the way that Moshe functions in the future and the way that his leadership will exhibit itself. And so above all, to me, this is just an invitation to keep rereading this parak and see how it manifests itself later on in Moshe's life. And also to think about how that our story of national salvation starts with an individual. That is often what really, really big dreams need to become moved in the world, is to have an individual whose strengths are far beyond anything we can imagine, and that we have a little bit of an insight into where they come from, into the people who've influenced their early life. But there's something that's utterly God-given about their ability to accomplish their mission in this world. And so to me, it's really always just such a moving way to begin the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, is to see sort of how Moshe himself emerges. And I would even say that his coming of age story, quote unquote, really continues into the next chapter as well. It's simply his coming of age now in the presence of God, now with an awareness of what his role is going to be. And I don't want to minimize Moshe by comparing it to any sort of modern literary parallels, but there are some good ones out there. There's a difference between how somebody functions in this world before and after they know that they have a special mission to accomplish in this world. And so Perek Bet is really Moshe's functioning in the world before he knows that he has a mission, and Gimel is really after. And I think that if you sort of will read along and look at Perek Gimel in that light, it also sort of provides some interesting clues also into the later stages of Moshe's leadership throughout the wilderness period. So wishing everybody a Chag Sameach, and I'm happy to, right, Yael, I think we can take 5 minutes to answer any questions if someone has.
Sure.
Someone raised their hand I saw in the chat. Maybe they lost their desire to ask the question.